It began not with a royal parade, but with silence inside Buckingham Palace. A silence that carried weight, centuries of tradition trembling beneath it. King Charles, frail yet fiercely aware of the tides of time, called for one final command, a decision that would shake the monarchy's foundation and redefine the future crown. Behind those golden doors, Queen Camilla's world shifted. Her crown, once a symbol of triumph, suddenly felt heavier, slipping beneath the shadow of Prince William's rising legacy. But what truly happened that day? What words were spoken when the cameras were off, and loyalty faced its final test? Because this wasn't just a royal order, and it was a father's farewell, and a monarch's reckoning. Before we step inside this royal storm, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories that reveal the truth behind the crown. And hey, if you think the royal family's world is all glitz and protocol, wait till you hear what really happened inside those palace walls. Let's begin. The morning began quietly, too quietly for Buckingham Palace. A thin veil of fog wrapped itself around the gates, muffling the sound of the guards' boots against the stone. The sky hung low, heavy with a stillness that only came before something monumental. Inside, servants moved in careful silence. Footsteps echoed through the corridors where history had always whispered. The same halls where kings had risen and fallen, where words once uttered behind velvet curtains had changed the fate of a nation. But today, the whisper was different. It wasn't gossip or ceremony talk. It was something heavier. "The king has called a private council," one maid murmured. "All senior members of the family," replied another, lowering her voice. "Even the queen?" "Especially the queen." A sense of curiosity mixed with fear rippled quietly through the palace walls. In his private study, King Charles III sat by the window, the morning light catching the silver in his hair. His breathing was shallow but steady, the kind that spoke of a man who had lived long enough to understand that even a crown couldn't slow time. A single piece of parchment lay before him, ink still drying, a seal, unbroken. He'd written his final command the night before, not as a ruler, but as a father. Behind him, the faint tick of a clock counted down the moments before history would shift. He looked up toward a framed photograph on the mantel, a picture of his sons taken years ago, when smiles came easier and duty hadn't yet divided them. Charles whispered, almost to himself, "It's time they see what legacy truly means." Meanwhile, across the palace, Camilla sat before her dressing mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, graceful, composed, but beneath the surface her heart was uneasy. She had worn many titles: the outsider, the other woman, and finally, queen consort. Each one had carved its own scar, each one earned through years of waiting, of endurance, of public scrutiny that could have broken a lesser soul. But lately, Charles had been distant. The man she had stood beside through scandal and silence seemed to be withdrawing into himself, speaking more often of legacy than love. She tried to brush the thought aside as her lady-in-waiting entered. "Your Majesty, the council begins shortly." "Yes," Camilla replied softly. "I suppose it does." Yet even as she rose, her gaze lingered on the crown resting nearby, the same one she'd worn at the coronation, glimmering under the cathedral lights. How heavy it had felt that day, and how much heavier it felt now. In another wing, Prince William walked down the corridor, his expression unreadable. He had been called to many meetings in his life, briefings, ceremonies, state duties, but this summons had felt different. His father's words the night before had been brief. "Come home, my boy. Tomorrow matters." William didn't know what to expect, but deep down he could sense it. Something final was coming. He paused by a portrait of his late mother, Princess Diana. Her eyes, painted with haunting realism, seemed to follow him. It was strange, how even now her presence could steady him. "You'd know what to do, wouldn't you, Mum?" he murmured. "You always did." By noon, the family gathered in the maple room, the same chamber used by monarchs for generations when facing matters of great importance. The air was thick, almost ceremonial. Charles entered last, Every head turned. His steps were slower than usual, but his gaze held a quiet authority, the kind that made even silence feel commanded. Camilla offered a small, easy smile, but Charles didn't return it. Instead, he moved to the head of the table, placed the sealed parchment before him, and waited. No aides, no press, no outsiders, just the family and the truth. "Thank you all for coming," Charles began, his voice low but clear. "What I'm about to say will not be easy, but it must be said." He paused, looking at each face: Camilla, William, Catherine, and the others. "A crown," he continued, "is not meant to be worn forever. It is borrowed, a symbol of duty, not possession. And I fear, my dear family, that we've begun to forget that." The words hung in the air. Camilla's posture stiffened. William exchanged a cautious glance with Kate. Charles went on, "The monarchy must evolve, or it will fade. My reign has been short, but it is time to think not of myself, or of tradition, but of legacy." He laid a trembling hand over the parchment. "Today I issue my final command as your king."
The room fell utterly silent. Camilla's breath caught. "Final?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Charles, what are you saying?" He met her eyes, not with anger, but with sorrow. "Camilla, you have served beside me with grace. But the time has come to pass the crown forward, not through bloodline alone, but through purpose." William's heart pounded in his chest. Charles's gaze softened as it turned toward his eldest son. "William, it's time. The future belongs to you." Gasps echoed across the room. Camilla's lips parted, stunned. "You can't mean—" "I do," Charles interrupted gently. "The monarchy must reflect the people's hope, not their history. My final act as sovereign is to ensure that when I am gone, the crown carries compassion, not controversy." And with that, he pushed the parchment forward. The royal seal gleamed under the light, the ink of history still drying. For a moment, no one moved. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Camilla stared at the parchment, her mind racing between disbelief and heartbreak. Years of sacrifice, endurance, and loyalty, now slipping away in a single moment. William, meanwhile, felt the crushing weight of both pride and grief. He had not expected this. Not so soon. Not like this. Charles leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. "History will remember me for many things," he whispered. "But I want my family to remember me for one, for letting go." And just like that, the first whisper of change swept through the palace, a whisper that would soon echo across the world. That night, the palace didn't sleep. The great chandeliers were dimmed, yet the air still shimmered with the echoes of what had been said in the maple room. Every corridor seemed to hum with quiet confusion, as if the portraits of long-dead monarchs were whispering among themselves, unsure whether to approve or mourn. And in her private chamber, Queen Camilla sat alone. The fire crackled softly, throwing golden light across her face, but her expression was one of quiet devastation. Before her, on a velvet cushion, lay her crown. Once, it had been her triumph, the symbol that she had finally been accepted, finally forgiven by a nation that had once judged her harshly. But now, it looked more like a reminder that every crown, no matter how bright, carries a shadow. Camilla rose from her chair and walked toward the window. Outside, the palace gardens lay in darkness, but she could see the faint glimmer of the city lights beyond the gates, the world she had fought so long to belong to. "After everything," she whispered to herself, "after everything we endured." Her voice trembled, because it wasn't just about power, not for her. It was about love. She remembered the years of being called the other woman, of having to hide behind closed curtains, of hearing her name dragged through every headline. And through it all, Charles had stood by her, his quiet reassurance, his belief that their love would outlast public opinion. It had been her anchor. So how could he now, in his final act, take away the one thing that had cost them both so much to reach? Her fingers brushed the window pane, cold against her skin. "He promised," she murmured, "we would rule together, until the end." Down the corridor, William and Catherine sat in silence. The evening tea had long gone cold, but neither seemed to notice. William stared into the fireplace, lost in thought, while Kate watched him, not as a princess, but as a wife who understood the battle inside him. He looked tired, Kate said softly. He's been tired for months, William replied. But I never thought he'd do this. There was a long pause. The crackle of the fire filled the silence. You think Camilla will accept it? She asked. William exhaled, rubbing his temples. No, not easily. She's fought too hard to get where she is. But he's the king. His word stands. Kate hesitated. It won't be just a royal decision, Will. It's personal. He's asking you to carry his legacy, and hers to step aside. Her words were gentle, but the weight of them hung heavy in the air. William turned toward her. I didn't ask for this. I never wanted to take the crown this way. Not like this. Kate smiled faintly. You didn't choose it, but maybe it's choosing you. Her voice carried that quiet strength that had always grounded him, a reminder that while the crown was made of gold, its weight was made of love, loss, and duty intertwined. Elsewhere in the palace, Charles lay in his private quarters, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had not expected to feel this much peace, nor this much sorrow. It wasn't an easy thing, stripping away a title from the woman he loved. But he knew, deep down, that the monarchy couldn't survive on sentiment. It needed renewal, not nostalgia. He looked at the side table, where an envelope said addressed to "My dearest Camilla." His handwriting wavered slightly, a symptom of both age and emotion. He began to write again, quietly, the pen scratching softly against paper. My dear, if love were enough, the world would never change. But duty demand that we give even what we love most. Know that this command is not a rejection. It is my protection for you, for William, and for what is to come. History may question me, but I hope you never do. See. When he sealed the letter, his eyes glistened. He whispered to the empty room, You'll understand someday, my darling, when the world begins to heal. Morning arrived, pale and solemn. Camilla entered the king's study before breakfast. She didn't knock. She never had to. Charles was already awake, dressed, standing by the same window where he'd written the letter the night before. She closed the door behind her, her voice steady but cold. So it's true. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. It is. You're asking me to give up everything I've stood beside you for. I'm asking you to let me end this reign with dignity, to let William start as with peace. Her eyes filled, but she refused to let the tears fall. And where does that leave me? It leaves you as you've always been, the woman who stood by my side, even when the world turned its back. You'll always be that to me, Camilla, but not to history. The words sliced through the air, quiet but cutting. Charles didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was already written between them, written in sacrifice, in years of endurance, and now, in one irreversible command. As Camilla left the room, the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly. Every portrait she passed seemed to watch her. Queens before her, each bearing their own silent story of loss and endurance. She reached the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing faintly, and paused. A group of palace staff stood at the far end, whispering softly. When they saw her, they fell silent, bowing respectfully. For a moment, she almost faltered, but then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and kept walking, the grace of a woman who refused to let history see her break. Behind her, the crown remained locked in her chamber, unworn, uncertain, and as the sun rose over the palace, the queen who had once fought for love walked into the day, knowing she might now lose it. Not to scandal, but to time. The following morning dawned gray, the kind of British sky that seemed to mirror the heaviness inside the palace. But in a small sitting room overlooking the gardens, Prince William sat alone, staring out at the mist-covered lawns where the royal hounds used to play. He wasn't thinking like a prince, or even like a future king. He was thinking like a son, and that was the hardest part. Because for all his life, the crown had never been his pursuit. It had always been his inheritance. Something handed down through centuries, not something he'd ever asked for. Yet now, his father had placed it before him like a gift wrapped in grief. He heard the soft knock before the door opened. It was Catherine, holding 2 cups of tea. "You've been up since dawn," she said, setting the tray beside him. "Couldn't sleep?" William murmured. She sat down, her gaze gentle. "You've always said you didn't want this yet, but maybe it's not about one anymore." William sighed, rubbing his hands together. He's doing this because he knows time's running out. He doesn't want chaos when he's gone. But I don't think he realizes what this means for her. Camilla? Yes. She spent her whole life being judged, finally found peace, and now... He trailed off, looking toward the gardens again. Now it feels like he's taking it all away from her. Catherine watched him quietly, then said something that stayed with him all day. Maybe that's the point, Will. Maybe he's trying to save her from the weight of it, before it destroys her like it did him. Her words hung in the air like a bell still ringing long after the strike. Later that afternoon, William made his way to Clarence's house, the place that had been his father's refuge long before the crown. It was there that Charles waited, seated by the fireplace, a stack of old letters beside him. The room smelled faintly of parchment and aged wood, the scent of history. "You came," Charles said quietly as William entered. "You asked me to." Charles smiled faintly. "Still so dutiful. You get that from your mother." That single mention of Diana shifted the air between them. It wasn't a wound anymore, not entirely, but it was a ghost that lingered. "She had been proud of you," Charles said softly. "She had been furious with you," William replied, a small, sad smile tugging at his lips. Charles chuckled, the weary, genuine laugh of a father who knew his son was right. Yes, perhaps she would have. They sat in silence for a moment before Charles reached for the letters. "These were your mother's," he said, passing one to William. "Letters she wrote but never sent. She spoke often of legacy, not in crowns or castles, but in kindness." William unfolded the paper carefully. Diana's handwriting danced across the page, delicate yet strong. "One day, William will carry the burden of 1,000 years of history. My hope is that he carries it with heart, not just with heritage." William's throat tightened. "She always knew what mattered," he whispered. Charles nodded. "That's why this decision was never about titles, my boy. It's about what kind of king you'll be. The world doesn't need another ruler. It needs a bridge." "Between what?" "Between the past and the people. Between duty and humanity." He looked at his son with a father's honesty. "You are that bridge, William. That's the promise your mother saw in you, and the one I must now protect." Outside, the palace bells chimed softly in the distance, a sound that carried across London, unnoticed by millions, but deeply symbolic to the few who knew what was coming. William looked at his father, the man who had worn the weight of duty all his life, and for the first time he saw him not as a monarch, but as a man nearing his final chapter. "And what about Camilla?" William asked quietly. "She'll be hurt. You know that." Charles's face fell. "I know, and I will bear that pain. But she deserves to live her final years in peace, not chained to a crown that the world still debates. I will not let history judge her twice." William exhaled, his voice low. "You really think the people will accept me now, after everything that's happened?" Charles smiled faintly. "The people have already accepted you, William. They watch you grow, stumble, love, and lead. You've been their prince far longer than I've been their king." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, frail but firm. "When I'm gone, they'll need someone who reminds them of hope. You've always been that, even when you didn't see it yourself." For a moment, neither spoke. The fire popped softly between them. Then William said, almost to himself, "Then I'll do it, not for crown, not for power, but for you, for Mum, for the people." Charles's eyes glistened. "Then that, my boy, is a promise fulfilled." Later that night, Catherine found William standing on the balcony. The London skyline spread before him, dark clouds shifting above the glowing city. "You spoke to him," she said. He nodded. "He's at peace with it. In a strange way, I think he's ready. And you?" He looked out toward the horizon, where the faintest light of dawn was beginning to rise. "I don't know if anyone's ever ready to be king, but I know what kind of man I want to be." Kate smiled, slipping her hand into his. "That's enough to start with." He turned to her, eyes soft but determined. He said something today about being a bridge between the past and the people. Then build it, she whispered, and let the world walk across. Below them, the palace clock struck midnight, and somewhere within those ancient walls, King Charles lay awake, not as a ruler, but as a father finally at peace, knowing that his crown was no longer just gold and jewels, but the promise his son had just made. The morning came quietly. No royal fanfare, no camera crews waiting beyond the palace gates. Just a faint sound of rain against the old glass windows of Buckingham Palace. Inside, time seemed to slow. Even the ticking of the great clock in the grand hall sounded softer, more deliberate, as though it, too, knew that something sacred was about to end. King Charles sat in his chair by the window, wrapped in a wool blanket. A physician waited discreetly by the door. Catherine had sent flowers, lilies, his favorite, but it was William who arrived first. No guards, no aides, just a son walking to the palace halls that had shaped his destiny. When he entered the room, Charles looked up and smiled faintly. "You look like your grandfather today," the king said. "I'll take that as a compliment," William replied softly. They both chuckled, the kind of brief laughter that comes when you know it might be your last together. Charles gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit, my boy. There's something I need to do. Properly this time." William obeyed, pulling the chair closer. The rain tapped gently on the window. The smell of old books and wax polish filled the room. "You remember when you were little," Charles began, "and you asked why I couldn't just quit being a prince?" William smiled faintly. "You said it doesn't work like that." "Yes," Charles nodded, "but it does end eventually. Not by choice, but by necessity." He reached for a small wooden box resting on the side table. The royal crest was carved into its lid. Inside lay a folded parchment, the very same one from the maple room, now signed, sealed, and ready. "This," Charles said, "is my final act as king of the United Kingdom, my abdication and your succession." William's heart caught in his throat. He had known this moment was coming, yet hearing the words felt like stepping off a cliff. "Father," Charles raised a hand gently. "Let me finish." His voice was calm, but frail. "I've served this country as best I could, but a monarch's true gift is knowing when to step aside before time decides for him." He looked toward the window again. "Camilla understands now. She came this morning." William blinked. "She did." Charles smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "if love brought us here, love should let us go. I think she's made peace with it, in her own way." A long silence followed. Outside, thunder rumbled softly in the distance. William stared at the parchment, at the trembling signature of his father. It was more than ink. It was history, surrender, legacy. Charles spoke again, his voice quiet. "The monarchy cannot just exist. It must mean something. And it can't mean that without heart. That's what your mother understood. That's what I see in you." William swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can live up to what people expect." Charles gave a weak chuckle. "Neither did I. But you'll do better because you'll listen, not just to advisors, but to the people. That's the difference." He reached for his son's hand, his own shaking slightly. "Promise me one thing, William. Don't let this crown divide your family like it did ours. Wear it only if it helps others stand taller, never to make yourself feel taller." "I promise," William said, voice breaking slightly. The king smiled faintly. "Good. Then I can rest." That afternoon, the palace gates closed to the public. Only a handful of aides, clergy, and senior royals were present for the private signing. The abdication that would quietly change British history forever. Camilla arrived dressed in pale gray, elegant poise, her face calm but unreadable. She nodded politely to William and took her seat beside Charles, her hands folded neatly. As the archbishop read the ceremonial declaration, the gravity of the moment filled the room like a living thing. When it was time, Charles reached for the pen. His hand trembled slightly, but his eyes were steady. "By my will and for the good of this nation," he said softly, "I hereby relinquish the crown in favor of my son, Prince William Arthur Philip Louis, to be king of the United Kingdom and the realms of the Commonwealth." The pen scratched across parchment. A silence followed so deep it seemed to swallow the air. Then the Archbishop spoke. So let it be recorded, by the grace of God and by the will of the sovereign, that the crown now passes to King William V. William's breath hitched. He bowed his head slightly, not in triumph, but in reverence. Camilla closed her eyes, a single tear tracing her cheek, before she whispered, "Long live the king." The world would not hear the news until next day, but within those walls, the shift was complete. That evening, Charles sat quietly in the garden with Camilla. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet roses and damp stone. "Do you regret it?" she asked gently. "No," he replied. "I think, for the first time in my life, I feel light." She smiled faintly. "You were always more of a gardener than a king." He chuckled softly. "Maybe, but gardeners understand life better than rulers do. They know when it's time to prune and when to let new things bloom." She reached for his hand. For a while they just sat there in silence. Two souls who had lived through storms and scandal, now finally finding peace in the quiet. At dawn, William and Catherine stood at the balcony, side by side. The first light of morning bathed the city in gold, and the Union Jack fluttered above the palace. Lowered, then raised again under a new rain. Crowds gathered beyond the gates, their cheers rising like a wave. William turned to Kate. "He did it with love, didn't he?" She smiled. "Yes." That was his final command. Love, disguised as duty. He nodded slowly. "Then that's how we'll rule." The cheers grew louder. Cameras clicked. And for the first time, King William V stepped forward. Not as a man burdened by history, but as a bridge between past and future, his father's voice still echoing in his heart. "Sir, with heart," Charles had said, "lead with grace." As the morning sun rose higher over the palace, it seemed the monarchy itself had turned a page, one chapter closing gently as another began, not with grandeur, but with quiet love.